Alright guys, you asked for it, so here it is. Today's video is going to be a free review of the iPad app ibisPaint X. This is a follow-up video to my previous video in which I reviewed 5 free apps and compared them to the queen of all drawing apps, Procreate. So if you haven't already watched that, go and do that now. Lots of you commented asking me to review this app in particular because it's one that I missed from my previous video, so I thought I had to see what all the fuss was about and go and download it and review it for myself. Is it going to match up to Procreate? Let's see, and hey, maybe it'll even be better. Who knows? There's only one way to find out. If you're new here, remember to subscribe for lots more awesome crafty calligraphy content, and let's get on with the video. So let's talk about brush options first. So those of you who are already familiar with Procreate will know that there are probably hundreds of brush options on the Procreate app already loaded in, but there's also an amazing feature which allows you to import brushes that other people have made and create brushes from scratch, as well as a load of different options to edit the already kind of the default brushes in the app as well. This just means that your possibilities are kind of endless with the kind of art that you create. Like, you can always be creating new brushes, finding new brushes from other people, and always creating more interesting art. In ibisPaint X, there are perhaps not so many different brush options, but there were an awful lot, way more than I was expecting for a free app. And a really nice feature with it is that even though this is a free version, you can actually watch an ad to unlock all of the brushes for 18 hours. So you can pretty much have full access to the entire app without spending a penny, which is amazing. The brushes weren't organised into folders like they were in Procreate, which would have been nice. However, there were a lot of brushes that I found that were not similar to anything else I'd seen before. It was definitely fun to play around with. In terms of editing the brush settings, I was really pleasantly surprised by the different number of options that you had. Because my primary use for drawing apps is to do with digital calligraphy, it's really crucial for me that I can edit the brush settings as much as I possibly can to be able to create a look like a traditional calligraphy pen if I was doing it non-digitally. The fact that you can't import brushes into ibisPaint X meant that it was even more crucial for me to be able to do this, because I can't just load in one that somebody else has already created. There wasn't a calligraphy brush already available in ibisPaint X, but I did find that by editing this felt tip hard brush that I was able to pretty much recreate a calligraphy pen that I was really happy with and was pretty good for my needs. Here are all the details on how I edited that brush so that you can recreate it as well if you want to. While it wasn't exactly perfect, and I definitely think that the calligraphy pens that I have in Procreate are better, it's definitely the best result I've gotten out of any of the free apps that I've tried. Another great feature that you have in Procreate is the ability to add this streamline setting to your brushes, and this streamline feature essentially allows you to create a lot more smoother lines, which again is another feature that's really good to have for digital calligraphy. While you couldn't edit the setting directly within the brush settings, there was this smoothing option that you can see in the top right hand corner that you could turn on, and I just turned it all the way up to 10, and I found this was a pretty good alternative to streamline. Having said that, I think it is a lot better to have this option in the brush settings itself, just because it means that you can have different levels of streamline for different brushes depending on your needs, and you don't have to keep like switching between the different smoothing settings. Next, I wanted to talk about the different layer options. Having a good layer menu in a digital art app is really important. It makes your life a lot easier, and organising your work into layers is an absolute must in my opinion. The thing that I love about the Procreate layer menu is that it's super intuitive, and there are loads and loads of different options. When I was looking at ibisPaint X, I was really hoping to see something a little bit similar to that really. The main thing that I would say about ibisPaint X, and I'll talk about this in more detail later, but in general the usability of the app isn't that great, and this was especially obvious when I was using the layer menu. I did find that most of the options that I use regularly in Procreate were there in ibisPaint X, however it was a lot harder to find how to do things like reduce the layer opacity or put layers into groups, or even duplicating a layer it took me a while to figure out how to do that. There were also a lot of different blending mode options, pretty much I think the same as in Procreate, which I was really pleasantly surprised by. If you're not aware, the blending mode essentially determines how the layer in question interacts with the other ones in your canvas, so it can be a really handy tool for doing shadows and highlights and things like that. There was one setting that appeared to be missing, however, and that was the ability to set a background colour. So in Procreate you can set a background colour for your entire canvas. It's not really a layer, it's just kind of basically saying I don't want it to be white, I want it to be this colour instead. But there didn't seem to be a way to change this in ibisPaint X. There is a colour fill tool, however this was probably the most confusing tool that I found in the entirety of the app, because it definitely doesn't work in the same way that the Procreate colour fill kind of drag and drop tool does, because as a default it looks at the canvas as you're looking at it rather than considering each layer. So you can kind of see what I mean here. I was trying to fill in the background colour for it to be this blue colour, however I'd already drawn this heart shape on another layer, and even though I was trying to fill in this colour on the layer beneath that heart shape, it was still not filling in the space below the heart on the bottom layer, which was the background layer. So in order to get around this, I had to play around with settings a bit. I had to change the reference layer to current layer rather than, I think it was canvas it was already on. And that meant that I could fill in the layer regardless of what was on other layers. But I found it really confusing, and I don't know why you'd want to use the default setting of this tool. So the next thing that I wanted to look at was ways of transforming layers. In Procreate there are a huge number of options for this. You can change the whole colour of your layer by using the hue, saturation and brightness tool. You can also add noise really easily, which is a really cool way of adding texture to your pieces. And there are also lots of different blur options, which is, for me, one of the tools that I use the most beyond just kind of regular brushes. So these options in Procreate really take your pieces to the next level in my opinion. So it was really nice to see that actually ibisPaint X does include some of these options that you can find in Procreate. The main thing is though that they are quite limited. So as I mentioned before, the main tool that I use besides just brushes is the blurring options, especially Gaussian blur. I think, to be honest, I probably use this in every single one of my pieces that I've ever done. It's just a really key thing to have. And I did find this one blur tool in kind of the main tool bar at the side, but it didn't really work in the same way. It didn't allow you to blur the entire or the entire layer at once, and it didn't allow you to edit the sort of the strength of the blur. After filming this, I did realise that you can add a similar kind of blur effect to the entire layer by going to filters and then blur. You can add Gaussian blur, moving blur I think, and then a few other ones. Really, you can't really do the same strength of blur as you would be able to do in Procreate, but it is good to know that that is there, and actually it's not just this one blur tool, so that is good. I was also really pleasantly surprised to see that they offer a similar version of Procreate's Liquify tool under the special menu of the toolbar. This is a really cool tool in Procreate. I use it a lot to create cool patterns to basically use in my pieces. You can also use it to very slightly edit shapes that you've already put down on the canvas without having to redraw them. It essentially allows you to push and pull the pixels that you've already put down on the canvas. So this is a really fun tool to play around with, and it was really cool to see that ibisPaint X has something similar. Finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about how easy it is to use the app. One thing I really love about Procreate is that it's just such a slick app. All of the settings in the menus are generally really intuitive to use, and there's stuff that you can do like create shortcuts in the settings of Procreate so that you can kind of customize it a little bit more to how you use the app. So for example, you can say, oh, if I use my finger rather than my Apple Pencil, I want that to blur pixels rather than add brush strokes, for example. On top of this, another really useful feature in Procreate is that you can create these things called quick shapes. For example, if you draw a circle and you hold down your Apple Pencil, it will snap to a perfect oval. So things like that, which make it really easy to use and really easy to achieve the look that you want in your piece. And while ibisPaint X does have some features that Procreate has, for example, it has the 2-finger tap to undo and 3-finger tap to redo, generally there weren't very many extra settings like the kind of customization options that you get in Procreate. This isn't really a deal breaker for me because it's not really something that I use that often, but it is another thing that Procreate has over ibisPaint X. Another thing that I disliked about the free app is that, as I mentioned earlier, it's just not as user-friendly. I think it would take a lot longer for a beginner to pick up how to use ibisPaint X than it would for Procreate, just because it's not that ibisPaint X doesn't have the tools that you need, it's just that it's really hard to find where they are. One thing that I did like about the usability of ibisPaint X though was the brush settings. Even though there weren't as many as there were in Procreate, for some reason I found it way easier to understand what each brush setting did, as opposed to Procreate. Maybe this is because Procreate has so many different options, it can kind of get a bit overwhelming and confusing as well, but that was a good thing that I thought would be really great for beginners. So overall, I was really impressed with ibisPaint X just by playing around with the different features. But exploring the features is one thing. How does it stack up against Procreate when it comes to actually creating an art piece? That's what I wanted to find out. So I decided to create this piece in Procreate, and I decided I would recreate it in ibisPaint X just to see how easy it was and how it turned out as well. So the first thing that I did was recreate the background. So in Procreate, I was really easily able to do this just by using the radial symmetry tool and using the quick shape line feature, which meant that I could just create this kind of burst effect, I guess you would call it, really, really easily. And it didn't really take me that long at all. When I came to do this in ibisPaint X, I did actually find these ruler and symmetry tools in the top right hand corner, which allowed me to do pretty much the same thing fairly easily. It was a little bit confusing to have these two sets of rulers on the canvas at the same time, but it got the job done and pretty easily as well. When it actually came to creating the colour of the background, the process was pretty much the same on both apps. I just basically made the colour of this burst shape the same colour as the background, and then using Alpha Lock went over it using a textured brush just to give it this nice sort of semi-transparent textured look, which I thought was a lot more interesting than just having a solid colour. I then created this blurred circle in the middle, and definitely at the time I would have preferred it to be a little bit more blurred. This was when I was still just using the blur tool that you can find in the toolbar. It might have been a bit better if I'd used the Gaussian blur in the filters menu, I'm not sure. Again, this was before I found out that you could actually do this. Next was the actual focal point of the piece, which was the word fearless. So thanks to my handy calligraphy brush that I made earlier, I was able to recreate this fairly easily, and I used the lasso selection tool to basically just move around the F to make it a little bit closer to how it looked in the Procreate piece. I then used Alpha Lock again and added a little bit of this lighter colour at the bottom and used the blur tool again to create this gradient. I then duplicated the layer and changed the colour again using Alpha Lock and added these stripes of lighter colour, blurred those together, and that created a sort of shadow for the lettering. At this point, I do think that I realised that my brush wasn't quite right. You might be able to see here in certain points there's kind of a bit of a gap between the lettering and the shadow, so basically I don't think that my lettering was quite thick enough. It wasn't really an issue, to be honest. I think it just means that I need to play around with my brush settings a little bit more to get the exact look that I wanted. At this point in Procreate, I decided to add some noise to the top of my lettering under the Magic Wand adjustments menu. So this was just basically done by filling an entire layer above the lettering with a solid colour, then going to the adjustments menu, adding noise, and then just setting this layer to clipping mask, changing the opacity, and also changing the blending mode to, I think, soft light. I could be wrong. But this just basically adds a little bit of texture to your lettering. When it came to recreating this on ibisPaint X, I ended up finding this very similar option in the filters menu, which basically meant I could do the exact same thing, which I was super happy with and very pleasantly surprised by. I feel like I'm saying pleasantly surprised a lot in this video, but generally this is, you know, the way that I'm feeling about this app. So yeah, that was really great. After that, I just added the highlights on top of the lettering. Again, that was pretty much the same as in Procreate. When I finished the main word, I moved on to the UR lettering, and this bit went pretty smoothly, the lettering itself, until I had to do this kind of extended shadow behind the lettering. So there's this really cool trick in Procreate where you can basically put a motion blur on a duplicate layer of the lettering and then duplicate that layer a bunch of times until it's a really solid shape, and that kind of can give you the look of this sort of extended shadow. There wasn't the same option in ibisPaint X, so I just had to do this manually. It was this point that I remembered that I'd forgotten to add this glowing effect to the word fearless, so I just went back to that layer, duplicated it again, changed the colour to this light yellow, and added this blurring to it, which basically just makes the lettering stand out a little bit more. The effects didn't end up being as obvious as it was in the Procreate version, but again, I think this was just because I hadn't discovered this Gaussian blur option in the filter menu yet, so maybe it would have looked a little bit better if I'd used that. Everything beyond this point was pretty smooth, to be honest, and I actually really like the way that the lettering on the banner where it says remember turned out. I think even using my kind of makeshift calligraphy brush, it ended up looking really nice, which I was really pleased with. So I was pretty happy with the end result. I think I do prefer the Procreate version just because I think the word fearless stands out a lot more and just looks a little bit better and a little bit thicker. But I think To be honest, if I'd have just done the ibisPaint X version, I think I would have been really proud of that as well. I think it was pretty incredible that I managed to pretty much 100% recreate what I'd done in Procreate in this free app. So yeah, really impressed with the ibisPaint X app in general. I think having done this, it really goes to show how many options this free app offers. Does this make me an ibisPaint X convert? Not exactly. Like I mentioned, the usability of the app isn't quite there when compared with Procreate, but out of all the free apps I've tried, it honestly is 100% the best one. I would definitely wholeheartedly recommend this app to anyone who's looking to dabble in the world of digital art but doesn't really want to spend the money on Procreate, at least not just yet. So I'd love to hear what you guys think. Have you used this app before, or would you maybe use this app now that you've seen this video? Let me know as well if you'd like me to do any ibisPaint X specific tutorials, and of course if you found this video useful and interesting, please do give it a thumbs up, and remember to subscribe to my channel for a lot more calligraphy and art based content, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!